Ethan had always wondered why life seemed to choose him for the hardest lessons. From a distance, he looked ordinary, a young man living in a small city apartment, chasing small dreams that never seemed to catch fire. But inside, he carried a constant ache, the kind that made him whisper late at night, "Why does life treat me this way? Why me?" Every morning he woke up with the same question echoing in his mind, and every night he went to sleep without an answer. He wasn't lazy. He wasn't unkind. He had worked harder than most people around him. He'd been the kind of person who held doors open for strangers, helped neighbors carry groceries, and believed that good always returned to those who did good. But life didn't seem to work that way for him. His father died when he was only 16. His mother fell sick not long after, her laughter replaced by the sound of medicine bottles. Ethan studied hard, hoping to win a scholarship and change their lives. He missed it by a single point. One point, and all his dreams collapsed like glass on concrete. He took a job at a metal factory to keep the bills paid. Each day was a blur of sweat, smoke, and exhaustion. When he saw his reflection in the train window on his way to work, he barely recognized himself. The bright eyes of his teenage years had faded into dull gray circles. He still smiled politely at his coworkers, but the spark behind that smile was gone. Sometimes he looked at the city skyline and thought, all those lights, and still I feel like I'm in the dark. On a gray Thursday afternoon, rain began to fall heavily as Ethan walked home. He stopped by a small cafe, one of those quiet ones that smelled of coffee and old wood. He ordered the cheapest drink on the menu and sat by the window. The rain made the streets blur, turning headlights into smudged stars. Across the table, an old man sat sketching something in a notebook. His hand trembled slightly, but there was peace in his eyes. Ethan noticed that peace and envied it. Without looking up, the old man said, "You look like someone who's been arguing with life." Ethan blinked in surprise. "Maybe life's been arguing with me." The man smiled faintly. "Life doesn't argue. It teaches." Ethan scoffed. "Then it's a cruel teacher." The old man closed his notebook and looked at him. "Cruel, yes. But only to those who are meant to be strong. Easy lives make soft people. Hard lives shape strong ones." Ethan didn't reply. He wasn't in the mood for wisdom from a stranger. But the man's words stayed with him like a song he didn't want to remember. That night, as he lay on his bed staring at the cracked ceiling, he found himself whispering the words again, "Hard lives shape strong ones." He didn't want to believe it, but something about it felt true. The next day, Ethan went to work as usual. The same noise, the same smell, the same tired faces. But inside, a small seed of curiosity had been planted. He began noticing things he hadn't before, the way the older workers kept going despite pain in their backs, the way some of them joked even when the machines broke down. Maybe they too had stopped expecting life to be fair, and that's how they kept moving. Weeks passed, and his mother's health grew worse. Hospital bills piled up, and he took extra shifts to cover them. He barely slept. One evening, after another long day, he was walking home when he heard a soft whimper from an alleyway. He turned and saw a small puppy trapped under a piece of metal, trembling in the rain. For a second, he thought of walking away. He was tired, hungry, and cold. But something in him refused to ignore it. He ran over, lifted the metal, and freed the puppy. It whimpered softly, looking up at him with frightened eyes. Ethan wrapped it in his jacket and took it home. He cleaned its wounds, gave it some water, and placed it near a heater. The puppy, tiny and weak, curled beside him and fell asleep. That night, for the first time in months, Ethan smiled. The small creature's breathing was steady, calm, and peaceful. It reminded him that even in pain, life still had warmth left to give. He named the puppy Shadow. Every morning after that, Shadow followed him to the bus stop, wagging its tail. When Ethan came home late, exhausted, the little dog greeted him as if he were the most important person in the world. Slowly, something began to change inside him. He still struggled, still faced bills and fatigue, but now he had a reason to get up. A pair of brown eyes that waited for him every evening. Then, just when life seemed to give him a small breath of relief, it struck again. His mother passed away quietly one morning, before he could reach the hospital. Ethan stood beside her bed, unable to cry at first. The nurse said something about peace and rest, but her words faded into nothing. He walked home with empty hands and a heavier heart than ever before. Shadow followed him around the apartment that night, sensing something had changed. Ethan sat on the floor, staring at the wall. "Why does life keep doing this to me?" he whispered. "What did I ever do to deserve this?" The room stayed silent. The world offered no answers. Days turned into weeks, and Ethan moved through them like a shadow himself. He went to work, came home, and went to sleep. He didn't talk much. Sometimes he walked to the old bridge by the river at night, looking down at the dark water. It felt peaceful there, away from the noise of the city. He often wondered what would happen if he just disappeared, if the world would even notice. One night, after a particularly bad day at the factory, Ethan stood on that bridge again. Rain fell softly, and streetlights shimmered on the wet pavement. He leaned on the railing and whispered, "Maybe life would be easier if I just stopped trying." Then he heard a bark. Shadow had followed him again, soaked and shivering. The dog looked up at him, whining softly. Ethan sighed and knelt down, placing a hand on Shadow's head. "You don't understand, do you? You've never lost everything." But Shadow just pressed his head against Ethan's chest and stayed still. And in that tiny gesture, Ethan felt something break inside him, not from despair, but from realization. The world had taken a lot from him, yes, but it hadn't taken everything. It hadn't taken his ability to love, to care, to protect something small and fragile. He lifted Shadow in his arms and walked home through the rain. That night, he sat by the window, watching lightning flash in the distance. He thought of his father, his mother, his failed dreams. He thought of the old man in the cafe and his quiet words, "Easy lives make soft people. Hard lives shape strong ones." Maybe this was what that meant. Maybe strength wasn't given. It was built, one painful piece at a time. In the days that followed, Ethan began to see his life differently. He started reading again, books on design, architecture, and the art he once loved. He couldn't afford school, but he had the internet and determination. After work, he stayed up late sketching buildings and drawing lines that once existed only in his imagination. He posted some of his drawings online, not expecting anything. But slowly, people began to notice. A small following grew, people who saw something in his work, something raw and real. They didn't know his story, but they felt it in every stroke of his pencil. One day, a message came from a small architecture studio looking for freelance illustrators. Ethan stared at the email for a long time before replying. He started working nights for the studio, balancing it with his factory shifts. It wasn't easy, he barely slept, but it gave him purpose again. He was exhausted, but alive in a way he hadn't been in years. He began to save money, and for the first time, the future didn't look like an empty hallway. He still had moments when he whispered, "Life isn't fair," but now those words carried a different tone. Not anger. Not sadness. Just understanding. Because he had started to see that fairness was never the point. Growth was. Months passed, and Ethan's life quietly transformed, not through miracles but through endurance. The studio began giving him more projects, and he poured every ounce of himself into them. Some nights he would fall asleep at his desk, Shadow curled up beside him, pencil still in his hand. In those moments of exhaustion, when his eyes burned and his hands ached, he felt something unfamiliar, peace. The kind of peace that comes not from a perfect life, but from knowing you're finally moving forward, even if it's slowly. One evening, as he worked on a design for a new community center, he remembered the small town he grew up in. The cracked sidewalks, the faded houses, the place where his dreams were born and broken. He decided to dedicate his design to people like him, those who had fallen and gotten up again. When the studio presented his drawing to the city council, they approved it. His first real project was going to be built. He didn't celebrate wildly. He just sat quietly in his apartment, staring at the screen, smiling through tears. He whispered, "Mom, I hope you see this." Shadow barked softly, as if he did too. The years rolled on. Ethan left the factory and joined the studio full-time. His name slowly began appearing in articles and design magazines. He traveled to other cities, worked with other architects, and stood before buildings that were once only lines in his sketchbook. But no matter where he went, he carried his old notebook, the same one where he had once drawn shapes under the dim light of a broken lamp. On the first page, in shaky handwriting, he had written the words the old man had told him: "Easy lives make soft people. Hard lives shape strong ones." One day, he returned to the cafe where he had met that old man years ago. The place hadn't changed much, the smell of roasted beans, the rain tapping the windows, the same quiet hum of life passing by. He sat at the same table, half expecting to see the man again. But the seat across from him was empty. He smiled anyway and said softly, "You were right." A young waiter came over and asked if he was waiting for someone. Ethan shook his head. "No," he said. "Just remembering someone who once told me something that changed my life." When he walked out of the cafe, the rain had stopped, and sunlight broke through the clouds. He stood there for a moment, breathing in the scent of wet earth and new beginnings. He thought about everything, his losses, his pain, his growth, and realized that none of it was wasted. Every moment of struggle had been a thread in the pattern of who he had become. He had spent years asking why life was so unfair. But now, as he watched the world move around him, he understood that life had never been unfair, it had been deliberate. Every hardship, every tear, every lonely night had been preparing him for strength, compassion, and purpose. He remembered his lowest point, the bridge, the rain, the thought of giving up, and how a small, trembling dog had stopped him. He remembered his mother's gentle smile, the old man's quiet wisdom, the factory's relentless noise that had built his discipline. Life hadn't punished him. It had trained him. That night, as he stood on the balcony of his apartment, city lights glowing beneath him, he whispered again, but this time with gratitude, "Thank you for being unfair." The words felt strange, yet deeply true. Because he had come to see that without life's cruelty, he would never have discovered his strength, his resilience, his heart. He watched the horizon, feeling the cool breeze against his face. The world below looked alive, cars moving, people laughing, lights flickering. Somewhere out there, another young man was probably sitting in his small room, asking the same question Ethan once did. Why is life so unfair to me? Ethan wished he could tell him that the answer wouldn't come right away, but it would come when he was ready to see it. Life never takes without giving something back. It just gives in disguise, through pain, loss, loneliness, and failure. It gives lessons that no book can teach, courage that no classroom can offer, and empathy that no comfort can create. Life's unfairness is the hammer that shapes the steel of a human soul. As the night deepened, Ethan sat at his desk and began sketching again. This time, he wasn't designing a building for a client. He was drawing something personal, a bridge. Not just any bridge, but one that connected two cliffs surrounded by stormy waves. On one side, a figure stood alone in darkness. On the other, sunlight spilled across the rocks. In the middle of the bridge, halfway between shadow and light, the figure kept walking. He looked at the drawing for a long time and smiled. That was his story, the story of every person who's ever thought life was unfair. The truth was simple, life's trials were not barriers. They were bridges. He closed his sketchbook and leaned back, letting the quiet fill the room. Shadow lay by the window, asleep, his tail twitching in dreams. The city hummed outside, alive and endless. Ethan whispered one last thought before sleep took him. If life had been kind to me, I would have stayed soft. If life had been easy, I would have stayed ordinary. But because life was unfair, I became who I was meant to be. And in that truth, there was peace. Not the peace of a life without pain, but the peace of a soul that finally understood the reason for it. Years later, when Ethan's name became known in architectural circles, he was invited to speak at a youth conference. The hall was filled with students, faces full of ambition, but also uncertainty. When he took the stage, he didn't talk about success or money or talent. He looked at them, smiled softly, and said, "You might think life is unfair. Maybe it is. But that's exactly what makes it beautiful. Every time you fall, every time you lose, every time you break, it's not life trying to destroy you. It's life trying to build you." The room fell silent. Some of the students wiped their eyes. They didn't just hear his words, they felt them. Ethan stepped away from the microphone and looked up at the bright lights above the stage. He could almost see his younger self sitting in the audience, tired, lost, angry. He wanted to tell that boy, "Hold on. One day you'll thank life for every hard moment." After the event, a young woman approached him. Her voice trembled as she said, "Sir, I thought I was cursed. Everything keeps going wrong for me. But hearing your story, it gives me hope." Ethan smiled gently and placed a hand on her shoulder. "Then hold on to that hope. Life may not give you what you want, but it will always give you what you need to become stronger." She nodded, tears in her eyes, and walked away. Ethan stood there for a while, feeling the weight of his journey and the strange grace of it all. He realized that the unfairness he once hated had become his greatest teacher, and now, through his story, it was teaching others too. Later that night, he returned home, opened his old sketchbook, and turned to the first page again. The words were still there, faded but powerful. Hard lives shape strong ones. He traced the letters with his finger, closed the book, and whispered, "You were right, old man. You were right." Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance. Rain began to fall, softly at first, then heavier. Ethan opened the window and let the air in. Shadow barked at the sound, his tail wagging. Ethan laughed quietly. The rain didn't bother him anymore. It reminded him that storms pass, that darkness doesn't last forever. He stood there, eyes closed, feeling the rain on his skin, grateful for every unfair moment that had led him here. Because in the end, he realized that the most beautiful souls are not those who have never been broken, but those who learned how to shine through their cracks. And so, the boy who once believed life was unfair became the man who understood that life's harshness was never cruelty, it was creation. The creation of strength, depth, and wisdom. The creation of someone who could turn pain into purpose. The world outside kept moving, as it always did, but inside that small apartment, peace lived quietly in the heart of a man who had finally stopped asking, "Why me?" and started saying, "Thank you." Because life, in its strange, merciless way, had not been unfair at all. It had simply been honest. And honesty, though it hurts, is the greatest kindness life can ever give. And that's the truth, my friend. Life isn't unfair, it's preparing you. Every loss, every rejection, every sleepless night is not a punishment, it's a lesson. Life breaks you only to rebuild you stronger, wiser, and kinder. The next time you ask, "Why me?" remember Ethan's story, remember that sometimes the hardest roads lead to the most beautiful destinations. So don't curse your struggles. Thank them. Because in the end, the unfairness you feel today is the foundation of the strength you'll celebrate tomorrow.